everyone. Welcome to our of the day, examining methods of exploitation. I'm Andrea Palenko, a research scientist at Faunalytics, and I'm excited to present the first speaker of this session, Rimona Afana, a Romanian Palestinian researcher, lecturer, activist, and multimedia artist who will discuss a critical approach to confinement and explore creative ways of contesting it.
Hey, I'm Rimona and I'm sharing today my research on challenging animal captivity. Since I only have 10 minutes, this barely scratches the surface, but if you're interested, I'm glad to send you my full paper, so do reach out on LinkedIn or elsewhere. I'll be discussing first how captivity harms animals, second, how captivity has been challenged legally and civically, and third, how captivity could be redefined and criminalized. First, a bit on the motivations, forms, and effects of animal captivity. Billions of non-human animals today live and die in captivity across sectors like food, clothing, medicine, or entertainment. The torture and murder of animals relies on their confinement. Criminal yet legal sectors such as wildlife trade or industrial animal farming source their profits in the captivity, exploitation, and killing of animals. Sentient beings suffer physically and psychologically from captivity. Their need for freedom, autonomy, and bodily integrity collides with our so-called right to abuse them, cemented by animals' legal designation as property. Abducted from their habitats, wild animals are confined in small cages and can spend weeks in transport without proper food, water, adequate temperatures, and ventilation, lacking the ability to move, which creates intense physical and psychological stress. Once they reach their beneficiaries, animals continue life for months, years, or decades in captivity, or they're killed for their bodies to be used, or they die from illness, often a result of the trauma caused by abduction and confinement. Many of us recall animals at the zoo, pacing left and right with a vacant stare. Stereotypies are obsessive compulsive behaviors associated with confinement, such as pacing, swaying, circling, jumping over grooming, biting the bars of the enclosure or cage, or aggression towards other animals, humans, or even self. Stereotypic behavior becomes prevalent in captivity, attesting the intense stress of confinement. Also, many social animals are subjected to solitary confinement, which, just like for humans, exacerbates mental illness. Neuroscientist Laurie Marino documents that for whales, captivity produces chronic stress, which leads to immune system dysfunction, causing illness and premature death. Captive whales die from opportunistic infections and suffer from behavioral disorders indicative of brain damage. Sometimes traumas are passed on intergenerationally. One example is Hugo, an orca captive at the Miami Aquarium who died in 1980 of a brain aneurysm after repeatedly bashing his head against the tank's walls. Captive chimpanzees also exhibit serious behavioral abnormalities indicative of compromised mental health, such as hitting or biting themselves, eating feces, grooming stereotypically, regurgitating, plucking hairs. Farmed animals also experience horrific forms of captivity. They're kept in cages or crates, sometimes so small that they can't even turn around. The stress of overpopulated, tight enclosures causes mental illness for many. Also, animals are so excessively grown to produce more profit that their bones and joints often can bear the weight of their bodies. They end up not just captive in cages, but captive in their own bodies. For both wild and domesticated animals, captivity is tied to some form of torture and is typically the precursor of direct or indirect killing. Yet, gray areas remain on what constitutes captivity and whether all forms are harmful. A small-scale subsistence farming also keeping animals captive. Are rescued animals placed in shelters or sanctuaries also experiencing captivity? Are companion animals, domestic and wild, kept for life inside homes also captive? Given my prior work on war crimes and crimes against humanity, I see non-human captivity similar in forms and effects to human captivity. Though states and corporations profit differently from trapping their victims, humans and sentient non-humans suffer similarly from captivity. From slavery in ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, or European colonization in the Americas, humans once enslaved, just like non-human animals now still enslaved, experienced captivity, forced labor, torture, and murder. Another example is Syria's Saidnaya military prison, where thousands of dissidents have been imprisoned, tortured, and massacred. Captivity makes life unlivable for political prisoners and other individuals persecuted by states through a range of sinister methods, crushing their body and spirit. The captivity of both humans and non-humans is often a form of state and/or corporate crime. Captivity is part of a continuum of torturous practices used as a tool for maximizing political or economic profit. This introduction hopefully makes a case for why many forms of human and non-human captivity are non-criminalized crimes which need to be challenged. Next, I discuss some legal and civic initiatives seeking to free captive animals. Over the past decade, animal rights lawyers have invoked the writ of habeas corpus to free captive animals. Habeas corpus is a legal recourse protecting persons from unlawful and indefinite detention. Taking this approach when it comes to non-humans relies on two conceptual extensions. One, considering animals to be persons, which they are not. Animals remain property in most jurisdictions, and qualifying their confinement across various commercial sectors as a form of unlawful detention, which has mostly been rejected by courts. In 2013, the Non-Human Rights Project filed the world's first habeas corpus case involving non-human animals on behalf of Hercules and Leo, chimpanzees held captive in a lab in Louisiana. The court ruled that as non-persons, the two chimpanzees could not legally challenge their captivity. In 2018, they filed another habeas corpus petition to free Happy, an elephant held captive for the past 45 years at the Bronx Zoo, in recent years confined alone. As with the prior case, in 2022, the court ruled that the writ of habeas corpus only covers human beings. In June this year, they filed another habeas corpus petition on behalf of 5 African elephants confined for decades at a zoo in Colorado Springs. Another example is Tokite, a southern resident orca violently separated from her family in the Salish Sea, confined alone to a tiny tank at the Miami Seaquarium for the past 53 years, forced to perform daily. Prior legal efforts framed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act and the Animal Welfare Act failed to secure her release, but a new case was opened in 2019 by the Earth Law Center and their partners. The new legal argument for releasing the orca was framed around the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a law mandating the return to Native Americans the remains of their ancestors and objects of cultural patrimony. Tokite is presented as a relative of the Lami people who needs to be returned to her home and to her indigenous relatives. In March this year, this aquarium agreed Toki would be returned to the Salish Sea, but 2 weeks ago, Toki died, still in captivity. After her death, scientists and activists reiterated the call for an immediate worldwide ban on cetacean captivity. As we see, these actions to free captive animals rely on a strategic engagement with laws which typically exclude non-humans. But since animals remain under the property category within most jurisdictions, securing rights associated to personhood remains rare. Animal captivity has also been challenged civically through nonviolent resistance. Animal rights activists have exposed and resisted animal captivity through open and clandestine rescue, occupations, protests, advocacy petitions, awareness raising on social media, and so on. Open and clandestine rescue has been practiced for decades by activists. Since rescuers often end up on trial, these civic challenges to captivity also include a legal component. Some examples: the Animal Liberation Front has engaged mostly in clandestine rescue. Among their most notable actions is the release of about 10,000 mink from a fur factory in Sultan, Washington. Because ALF members have also committed property crimes, for instance, destroying facilities from vandalism to arson in labs, slaughterhouses, circuses, or fur farms, U.S. Homeland Security and the FBI have listed the organization as a domestic terrorist threat. Also involved in direct action for animals is UK-based Animal Rising, formerly known as Animal Rebellion. Their work includes open animal rescue and farm occupations, mass trespass at animal racing events, public-facing disruptions such as roadblocks, sit-ins, and so on. Last year, Wayne and Paul, investigators with Direct Action Everywhere, were acquitted by a jury in Utah of theft and burglary charges after rescuing 2 ill piglets captive at Smithfield Farms. This spring, 2 other members of Direct Action Everywhere were acquitted by a jury in California of theft charges after rescuing 2 sick chickens from a truck headed to a slaughterhouse owned by Foster Farms. These acquittals set significant precedents for the right to rescue animals held captive by criminal sectors like industrial animal farming. DXC is now involved in another rescue case and are leading a campaign to establish legally the right to rescue. As we see, resisting violence requires courageous actions like infiltrating, exposing, and destabilizing criminal industries. And though courts typically protect the interests of states and corporations, there are also cases when courts embrace a critical approach to violence and civil resistance. So in closing, we live amid times of unprecedented animal abuse and environmental destruction, but these are also times of unprecedented activism. People's minds and hearts are changing about the rights of animals and our duties towards them, and resisting animal captivity is one form of nonviolence we all can contribute to. By gradually expanding our cultural and legal definitions of genocide and torture to include animals, captivity and its adjacent crimes might be eradicated one day. To get there, we need direct action like open and clandestine rescue, strategic litigation, advocacy, and other initiatives challenging captivity. So the main points for animal rights advocacy would be one, understanding that the captivity of humans and non-humans has similar motivations, dynamics, and consequences can create interspecies compassion and solidarity. Two, since the normalization of captivity relies on its invisibility, we need to learn how criminal, though legal sectors profit from the confinement, torture, and murder of animals. And three, we need to empower ourselves to challenge captivity and to meaningfully support others who do so. Animal captivity can be exposed and resisted through research, publications, teaching, advocacy, litigation, direct action, protest, social media activism, artwork, among other ways. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope to meet you during the Q&A session.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We have a question from Susan in the chat. I'll read it out loud. How do you feel about rescued wild animals who are released, being kept in a zoo setting for the purpose of educating the public to the lives of these animals in the wild and the impact of hunting on young animals whose mother was killed?
Hey, do you hear me well?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Hello. Can I find the question in the chat box? Because I think
will
I lost some segments of it when you read
That's
it.
okay. I will copy and paste it back into the chat.
Thank you. First, I don't have the right background in terms of veterinary science to say anything meaningful about it, but of course, it's a nuanced problem. I think I probably generally embrace a more radical view on confinement. I often even see companion animals treated very well as captive. So of course, when it comes to wild animals who need freedom far more than domesticated animals, of course, on the one hand, I understand that they can't be released. That's sentencing them to death. But on the other hand, I think we need to be critical about how confinement impacts them.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question. I'm not sure if it's you can answer, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. This person asked, I'd love to know more about how it works. Do they only take sick animals, for example? Also, what do they do with 10,000 mink? Just release them into the wild.
Again, I'm trying to find a question because I think my internet connection is not stable.
Okay.
So I'm losing still parts of the syllables when
That's
you
okay.
read it.
I copied and pasted it in the text in the chat for you again.
Thank you so much. So again, I'm definitely not an expert in captivity or rescue or anything. It's just been a couple of months since I started researching this. But in terms of how I understand open rescue, so there's a very basic distinction between clandestine rescue and open rescue. In clandestine rescue, rescuers typically hide their identities, whereas in open rescue, they do not. So they take public accountability, and that doesn't mean just like they're seen by others, but they can be taken in by the police and charged and sentenced and so on. So that's the main difference in terms of accountability. And I would suggest you definitely follow Direct Action Everywhere, who are involved in multiple rescue cases. And actually, Faunalytics has recently published a short article analyzing the decision last year to acquit Wayne and Paul of theft and burglary charges. So that's a very good starter, I would say, about understanding animal rescue.
Thank you, Ramona. That was a really wonderful talk. So that's all the time we have. If you want to continue the discussion, please wait until the end of the session where you can go into a breakout room. So next, I'm going to introduce Catharine Krebs, a medical research specialist at the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. Catharine will present data on peer reviewer requests for animal experiments and the perceptions of authors who use non-animal-based methods about these requests.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Catharine Krebs, and today I will be telling you about our survey of researcher experiences with animal methods bias. I'm a medical research specialist with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, a US-based health advocacy organization that promotes ethical and effective research, testing, and medical training through the replacement of animals. At the Physicians Committee, I work toward the most responsible and effective biomedical research policies and strategies, primarily through advocacy targeting the world's largest funder of biomedical research, the US National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. Because the NIH and biomedical research more broadly are so reliant on animals, for the last few years, my team and I have been slowly chipping away at one major contributor to this reliance: animal methods bias. We've been doing this through an effort called the Coalition to Illuminate and Address Animal Methods Bias, or the CoLab. We are an international collaboration of researchers and advocates that is working to gather evidence of animal methods bias and mitigate its detrimental effects on biomedical research. So what is animal methods bias? It's basically the unfounded preference for animal-based methods. In the last decade, non-animal methods have advanced a great deal, making them the first choice for many researchers for a variety of reasons. They can reliably mimic human biology and clinical responses to translate preclinical findings into safe and effective treatments for patients in a more predictive manner, and they avoid the ethical and emotional burden of experimenting on animals. But because animal methods are still considered by many to be the quote-unquote gold standard for biomedical research, this can lead to the biased assessment of research that doesn't use animals. As a result, researchers may be pressured into conducting animal experiments, or they may experience negative career consequences. In this presentation, I'm going to tell you about how we came to identify and define animal methods bias, how we're continuing to explore the ways it manifests across the research pipeline, and how we're using this information to mitigate its harmful effects. Publishing, and particularly the peer review process, is one such realm where the assessment of research can be affected by animal methods bias. Publishing plays a crucial role in the advancement of science, helping to translate biomedical findings from bench to bedside, as you can see in this simplified diagram. Peer review is the evaluation of research proposals or findings by qualified professional peers, and it is intended to ensure quality. But peer review is an imperfect system that can be affected by unconscious biases. And because publishing plays a major role in the progress of researchers' careers, they are heavily incentivized to publish at all costs, which can sometimes cause them to capitulate to reviewers' unjustified expectations or requests. So acknowledging that animal methods bias affects other aspects of research too, like the review of grant applications, we've defined animal methods bias in publishing as the preference for animal-based methods which affects the likelihood or timeliness of a manuscript being accepted for publication. Prior to our investigations into animal methods bias, there had only been anecdotal evidence. If you asked around, researchers who use non-animal methods either had experience with this personally or knew someone who had. There were even memes about it, like this one. So in 2021, in collaboration with Humane Society International, we set out to gather evidence of this bias systematically by conducting a survey to assess the experiences and perceptions of authors and reviewers related to animal and non-animal based experiments during peer review, and specifically when reviewers request that animal experiments be added to a study that otherwise had no animal experiments. Out of our total sample of 68 respondents, 21 said that they have performed animal-based experiments for the sole purpose of anticipating reviewer requests for them. In other words, outside the context of review, they did not think the experiments were necessary. 30 of our survey respondents have been asked by reviewers to add animal-based experiments to a study that otherwise had no animal-based experiments. And when we asked these researchers whether they felt that those requests were justified, 11 of them said that they did not feel the requests for additional animal experiments were justified. 14 indicated that they were sometimes justified, and only 3 felt that they were. When we asked our respondents to elaborate on their experiences, here are some highlights of some things that they said. The study was about heterogeneity of cancer cells from human tissue samples. It was irrelevant to do an experiment on mice. Reviewers ask for animal experiments because it is customary, not because it is necessary. Many are unaware about the potential of non-animal methods. The journals that wanted animal experiments were journals with higher impact. There is no incentive to not do animal experiments. In my experience, reviewers on grant panels are even more likely to ask for animal experiments than manuscript reviewers. Our survey identified some potential sources of animal methods bias, including reviewers' preference for animal methods or their unawareness of appropriate non-animal methods. We also identified some potential impacts, including delayed time to publication, rejection or withdrawal of manuscripts, publishing in lower impact journals, and performing animal experiments which would have not otherwise been performed. If you're interested in reading more about the study, you can find it on Alltext or by following this QR code. This survey has provided preliminary evidence of animal methods bias in publishing, and it has served as the foundation of our work to explore this issue further and develop strategies to mitigate it. But it had several limitations. With only 68 respondents after applying exclusion criteria, this number is too small to make any generalizations about how these data might apply to the total population of researchers that use non-animal methods, which ranges in the millions. We've estimated that to do this, we would need a sample size of 385 survey respondents. And because we relied on our professional networks and social media channels to disseminate the survey, we likely ended up with a non-representative sample comprised of researchers who feel strongly about avoiding using animals in research. This recruitment strategy also limited our ability to calculate sample characteristics like response rate, which are important measures of reliability. Because we're gathering this evidence so that we can convince the scientific community, journals, and funders that animal methods bias is a legitimate problem in need of solutions, we need our findings to be as trustworthy as possible. So we turned to some social science experts at Faunalytics for help, Drs. Andrea Polanco and Joe Anderson. With them, we designed a follow-up survey that will maximize our response rate and allow us to generalize our findings to the population of researchers that use non-animal methods. The follow-up survey has only 17 questions compared to 33 in the original, and the questions were tested for clarity and to ensure that the average completion time is less than 5 minutes. A shorter survey helps achieve a higher response rates. We're also targeting a larger sample size of at least 385 so that we can generalize our findings. We aim to ensure this higher sample size both through a shorter survey and through an incentive, a chance to win one $100 gift card per 50 respondents. And in contrast to our previous method of using our professional networks and social networks to recruit participants, our recruitment plan this time is to send invitations to researchers who have published studies with non-animal methods using information gathered from a large publication database called PubMed. I was hoping to have some preliminary findings to share with you all today, but unfortunately we are still in the data collection phase, so please stay tuned for updates. In addition to the follow-up survey, the evidence working group of the CoLab is conducting a publication analysis to assess other aspects of animal methods bias, like the presence of animal experiments after peer review, but not before. We're also looking at the effect of animal versus non-animal use on the impact of research. And we're using this evidence in the mitigation working group to engage with stakeholders listed here, to raise awareness about animal methods bias, to implement mitigation strategies, and to ultimately reduce the biomedical research reliance on animals. You can find out more about our work by visiting our website at animalmethodsbias.org or following this QR code. We are in the process of building out a more comprehensive website with a variety of information and resources, but for now you can find an overview of our ongoing activities, links to our publications, and you can join our mailing list to stay up to date. You can also email us at info@animalmethodsbias.org if you're interested in getting more involved or to tell us about your personal experience with animal methods bias. And you can find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. So thank you especially to our team at Faunalytics, Joe and Andrea, who helped us with this study, and our members of the evidence working group of the CoLab, Ignacio Helder, Lila, and then the other folks listed who contributed to this work along the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Sorry if my internet's cutting off. Catherine, MD you the questions in case I cut out. But yeah, the first question in the chat box was, how can institutional animal care and use committees be obligated to comply with the oversight of CoLab?
Thank you for that question. It's a really interesting question. I would say that, I mean, unfortunately, the CoLab is not exactly an oversight body. Maybe at some point in the future, we could contribute to those efforts, but we are considering where else, other than publishing, animal methods bias has an effect. And so I mentioned in the review of grant applications, but potentially in ICUC protocol evaluations, that could be another area. Also, we think that probably in hiring decisions and tenure decisions and those sort of career-related evaluations of research, that could be another area where animal methods bias can play a role in how research is evaluated. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer related to institutional animal care and use committees right now.
And are you involved in any wider efforts to get science done better?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. That is definitely one of the major goals of the CoLab. We feel that, and at the top of my presentation, I mentioned some of the many reasons why researchers may choose to use non-animal methods. And many of these reasons are scientific reasons. Non-animal methods are in many cases more reliable, and they help us translate preclinical findings to improved patient outcomes, sometimes faster and with lower resource burdens. So, and because animal methods bias is one barrier to using non-animal methods, then our hope is that by reducing the impact of animal methods bias, we can contribute to improving research and science and medicine.
No, thank you so much. There are more questions coming in, but I do encourage you all to join the breakout room at the end of this session to continue the discussion with Dr. Catharine Krebs. Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce our last speaker in this session. Her name is Chiawen Chiang. She is a graduate student in animal studies at New York University, and she's going to discuss a paper on the welfare risks of different fishes.
Hello everyone, I'm really excited to be with you all today. My name is Chiawen Chiang. I am presenting preliminary research of an ongoing study I am working on with Becca Franks at NYU's Department of Environmental Studies. My presentation today will explore the welfare issues in aquaculture and how we as animal advocates might find some ways forward. Aquaculture is the farming of aquatic or marine plants and animals, and it is a rapidly growing industry. Its growth in production exceeds all other forms of agriculture. And this means that fairly recent practices of farming aquatic animals that only picked up in the last century could likely follow the path of land-based farming, becoming more exploitative, cruel, and powerful as an industry over time. And this is a serious possibility. Researchers have already developed certain breeds or strains, which is a technical term, for tilapia fish that can gain twice as much weight as a wild version in the same amount of time. And similarly, the US government is already funding research groups and workshops to further domesticate other wild species. And we can see the impacts of this in how the number of fish species that we farm has dramatically increased in the past few decades, moving up from 100 species in the 80s to about 300 today. And yet we know so little about their welfare and how to take care of these animals. Of the 400 different species that we farm, about 70% of these have remarkably little information about their welfare needs. In this graph here, the y-axis is the number of publications, and the dots represent each unique species. And here, like most of the dots are encapsulated in the region with less than or equal to 4 welfare publications per species. And this means that a vast majority of the farmed aquatic animals today are under risk of extremely poor welfare, since we're rapidly farming these animals with no idea about what it means to give them a good life. Some researchers are working on this problem by analyzing them species by species. So far, they've covered 83 different species. But what about the field as a whole? Considering that there are so many individuals at risk and such a high level of density to cover, should we develop some kind of triage to determine how best to place our efforts for advocacy? The wide range in diversity of farmed aquatic animals means that they also have varying levels of adaptability to domestication, where some species may be more prone to welfare concerns than others. For instance, parrots, elephants, polar bears, orcas are all prone to experiencing mental and physical health issues when they're being held in captivity. And conversely, others are more flexible and tend to adjust better to domesticated environments. So, this leads to the question, which species then of farmed aquatic animals are more vulnerable to welfare problems in captivity? So our project dives into this problem by breaking it down into 2 phases. Phase 1 asks which characteristics are likely to predict a species' welfare outcome, and phase 2 determines what species are exceptionally at risk of poor welfare given these characteristics. And let me define first what characteristic means. So in this project, we define a characteristic as any physical or behavioral trait or condition that might predict poor welfare in captivity. So for instance, species wherein their natural diets involves handling their food a lot, breaking open nuts and seeds, manipulating fruits in a complex way, tend to have increased reports of suffering mentally and physically in captivity. And this has also been demonstrated for other traits as well. So our research hopes to pull characteristics from different fields to find how they might apply to aquatic animals. And we investigated from 3 different areas: captive animal welfare literature, which is research focusing on the well-being of animals in zoos and aquaria. And they tell us about how even in the best case scenario, when we are focusing solely on the animal's mental and physical health, what are the challenges we might face? And we complement this by also looking at invertebrate and vertebrate domestication literature to see how captivity over multiple generations can be impacted by certain traits. And this field is essentially trying to see what makes certain species easier or harder to domesticate than others. And lastly, we see how they might apply to aquatic animals by looking at aquatic animal welfare literature and see if these characteristics would apply to them given their life history, behavior, and biology. I will briefly skip through the methods for this presentation, but I'm happy to chat more over email or in the Q&A about our methods. But it's important to note here that we are not interested in proving or disproving whether these characteristics actually determine welfare in some way, but rather we assume that because they are discussed in literature, we assume that they could, and that our work is a best guess estimate based on the available knowledge that we have. And overall, our results have shown that about 40 characteristics exist that could potentially determine how well or poorly they will cope. And some of these were found to be a point of concern in all three fields, such as migration, whether or not they are solitary, and while other characteristics were only mentioned in one or two fields. I think it's important to appreciate that this is an incredibly long list, much longer than we initially thought, and with so many parameters that we potentially should be thinking about, that has not necessarily translated to the research, investment, and expansion efforts that we have seen trying to further domesticate wild species. So this is definitely a call for us to consider that and turn around the tide and maybe think more deeply about it. And moving on to phase 2, where we are actually trying to collect this data on a species level. We are currently at step 2, so unfortunately we can't report yet which specific species are potentially really poor candidates for expansion, but I'm happy to share some initial insights. Overall, we've found 625 species of aquatic animals recorded to have been farmed since 1950. We have, for fish, 423, mollusks, which are things like bivalves, clams, squids, octopus, and arthropods, which are crustaceans such as lobsters, crayfish, and shrimp. The other category also involves things like sea squirts and turtles, unfortunately. For fish, which is the most data-rich compared to mollusks and arthropods, the data seems to indicate that providing them with a life that enables them to engage in these characteristics will be either economically or environmentally challenging, at least. From what data we are able to gather, about 30% of fish species are engaged in some form of parental care, nest building, guarding of eggs. 96% perform at least one form of migration throughout their life, and 75% almost exclusively hunt macrofauna. In terms of their depth range, they typically traverse at most 99 meters, and in comparison, the Statue of Liberty is only 93 meters. So what are some takeaways from the data so far? First is that we are extremely highly data deficient on most of these characteristics, and efforts to further domesticate without first even understanding them is likely going to result in very poor welfare outcomes. And from the data that we are able to collect, the trend is that many of their rich, complex lives will need to be fundamentally changed in order to be domesticated. They won't be able to engage in migration, parental care, or they will have their diet radically altered for sustainability reasons, and if unsuccessful, will contribute even more to overfishing and the suffering of fishes caught for fish meal. So where do we go from here? Luckily, there might be a way to prevent the industry from taking off at all. For instance, the farmed octopus ban in DC, the UK, and now Canada is a preemptive strategy to signal to potential investors and researchers that farmed octopus is not a product that is financially attractive. And hopefully we can implement the same strategy for a species that we find to be of exceptionally high risk and also extremely poor for the environment in terms of sustainability. Hopefully we would like to limit further research, investment, and resources into domesticating new species before industries gain political power. And instead of going for a piecemeal approach of selecting just to ban octopus farming, perhaps we can think about putting a blanket ban on all species that are found to be extremely high risk of poor welfare. And lastly, we should perhaps think about leveraging the rhetoric that we have for keeping wildlife wild as a way to advocate against further species domestication. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We have some questions in the chat. So the first one was, do you have any recommendations for bridging the gap between animal advocates and those working in ocean conservation / science who I find too often don't make the leap to stop eating aquatic animals?
Yeah, I think that's a very great question. And I myself actually come from ocean conservation before I became passionate about aquatic animal welfare. One thing that I would say is that personally, I think it would be strategic to highlight the concept of intersectionality, that all of these issues, like both like the destruction of marine ecosystems, climate change, ocean acidification, and also like animal oppression and like factory farming are all like somehow rooted in like the same value system that has caused these problems, like human exceptionalism and like a general lack of respect for wildlife and for nature. So I feel like sort of like keying into this idea that we see a lot of symptoms in our society now are actually part of like an underlying issue of just this fractured sense of our relationship to the rest of the world might be some good way to sort of like link together and see like take a step back and be like, hey, yeah, I know that we're all fighting for a better world. We're maybe dealing with different facets of the problem, but ultimately they're sort of like all caused by the same problems of just sort of like this lack of respect and a an imbalance of how we view ourselves like as humans in relation to the rest of the world. That's personally how I would think about it. But that's a great question, yeah.
And that was a great answer. Thank you. Second question, someone asked, do you think it's early enough in the expansion of industrial aquaculture that we could, in theory, use this kind of information to stop some forms of it developing?
Yes, absolutely. And that is what I would say is the sort of like the inspiration for the project to begin with. We took inspiration from the amazing work that's happening now to prevent octopus farming from expanding rapidly. And so we were thinking that, that this push came from a place of thinking about these animals in a different way, thinking about them as these incredible creatures with like very complex lives. And what we are hoping to do with this paper is to pull out that like it's not just octopuses that need our help. There are so many other species that are at the cusp of like expanding rapidly. There was a slide that was showing that had, that illustrated how the US government, international like institutions, um, academic institutions are really pulling in research to like find out how to better domesticate a lot of different species that we really don't know as a household name, but could really use our help too. So we're hoping that like this paper would just sort of like bring that to the forefront. And instead of taking a like reactive approach to factory farming, maybe we can do a preventative approach to limit these systems from developing like things like path dependencies before they get too big to that like becomes like much more difficult to regulate over time.
Thank you so much. It looks like I'm not sure if anyone else asked a question. But yeah, for any continued discussions, we can open the breakout room now. So yeah, you'll see a little box pop up. If you want to join the breakout room with any of these three speakers, scroll all the way down where it says examining methods of exploitation and click join. You can continue the discussion there. It's not recorded or anything. It's very informal. So definitely encourage you to, ask our speakers more questions. And our last session of the day, which is a panel with faunalytics researchers, including myself, will start at 4:10 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you, everyone.